70,000 Indigenous peoples that live in Toronto. So First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and people from all over the world who are Indigenous that happen to live in our global city. This image is of the brickworks. I was fortunate to work on the brickworks and designing and creating green infrastructure when I worked at a firm called DTAH. I left that firm and went to the city of Toronto. So in the distance, I worked downtown. A lot of my work there was thinking about how to bring nature into the city, this concrete jungle, and how to change the way we do work. As we do this work, it has to happen anyway. Why are we not bringing in more in nature and catching stormwater where it falls and so on? But I thought a lot also about how these lands have been cared for, by First Nations. Hold on a second. It was not switching for me. There we go. Got it going. And, since, as Carolyn said, since time immemorial, the First Nations were here. The settlers have only been here a few hundred years. These lands were cared for. Mother Earth was cared for by the Indigenous peoples who walk these lands. And I've been thinking a lot about how, as this work of caring for the earth grows. So in 2018, there was a report done about the green infrastructure sector contributing over $8.33 billion to the economy. There were over 120,000 jobs created. And I realized as I looked around that I did not see Indigenous voices and Indigenous peoples in this work. Few, but not many. So I ended up leaving the city of Toronto and I went to work at the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. And I thought about ways we could change things through the work we do as professionals and people who are caring for the earth. But I ended up leaving TRCA, and in 2020, I started my own company called Spruce Lab. I really sought to honor my responsibilities as someone who has Mi'kmaq ancestry to prioritize Indigenous voices through the work I'm doing, which is nature-based solutions, green infrastructure. So many terms have changed over time. It's really about caring for Mother Earth. And with my team, I have staff that are trained and have awareness training to work with Indigenous people. We work directly for and with First Nations, and we seek to really implement the truth and reconciliation calls to action that are focused on education, employment, access, collaborative art projects, and corporate responsibility. So some of the things that I have been making happen through connections and creative questions and discussions. One of them was at the City of Toronto. I was working on a green infrastructure pilot project called Raindrop Plaza, and speaking with an educator at the Wandering Spirit School and Elder Pauline Shirt. And I invited the students into designing the project with me and asked them, what would you like to do? This project's about water, where it falls, how it goes to the trees. We talked about watersheds, and they decided they would like to do a traditional beading program and created these beautiful beadworks. This is just one of them on Nibi, and Nibi, it means water in Anishinaabe. Water is sacred. I've been thinking a lot about how in green infrastructure we talk about water quality, water quantity, surface water runoff, but the sacredness of water is never discussed. So I left the city. I was asked to lead the design services team at the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, and I was thinking about this still. And I sought to work with our education and training people, the program directors there. And I found a property called Bolton Camp and asked the program manager, Lucia Piccini, who's actually now the program manager at Evergreen. So things have come full circle. I asked her if we could co-found a youth program that would introduce Indigenous youth to different opportunities in the green infrastructure work, but at the same time looking at sustainable design, landscape architecture, and environmental planning, and having Indigenous professionals speak to them directly. That program is now in its 5th year. It was well received. We had over 27 mentors and we had sponsors. The youth were paid. It was really important to me that the youth were paid for not just creating the program with us, but that it would be their first job. And so this is an image of them doing a bee survey, which is a fun day. And when I left the Conservation Authority and started up Spruce Lab, I had been thinking about that model of taking opening doors by just experiential learning opportunities, Indigenous-led as much as possible. And so I was reaching out to Missouri Beak last summer and talking to them about creating a green infrastructure training focused on earth tending for adults that may have a high school degree, may not. It doesn't really matter. They're interested in nature and interested in doing this work. We have some funding to hire 7 people. Carolyn is one of our 5 Indigenous trainers. We have 13 trainers overall, and we're running it part-time so people can fit it into their lives, but they have to be unemployed or underemployed. And the overall goal really is about, as Carolyn speaks, is about connecting to nature and culture, but also creating opportunities for Indigenous people in this work and decolonizing and diversifying the green infrastructure sector, and not just talking about it, but actually doing it, learning by doing. And that is an Indigenous principle, right? So building capacity, creating relationships, and learning as we go and improving as we learn. We are supported as in an advisory capacity by Green Infrastructure Ontario Coalition, and Landscape Ontario has been really very helpful helping us with thinking about educational programming, and will be coming and giving talks about apprenticeships and job training, and they're committed to helping people take the next step after this program. I'm just going to end here, and I think that was a lot. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carolyn and Sheila, for starting off our final session. Yeah, I think it definitely gives us a lot to think about, and it's amazing to see some of the work that you're doing. All right, so next up we have a joint presentation as well with Patrick Gilbride at Reap Green Solutions and Alexander Marson, who's with the City of Guelph. So let me know if you're able to share your screen. If not, I can pull it up.
Thanks, Christine. I'll just try and bring it up here.
Perfect.
How's that?
It's great. Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. So thank you, Christine, and fellow presenters for that wonderful sort of lead-in as well. So I'm Patrick Gilbride. I'm the Associate Director of Reap Green Solutions. And I want to thank Green Communities Canada for inviting us to present on the partnership model that we've developed and been delivering with the City of Guelph over the past 4 years. Where I'm situated, we work throughout the watershed, and so we always like to recognize our debt to the traditional stewards of the land, including the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples, and our commitment to reconciliation. That was a great reminder of reconciliation, not only with Indigenous peoples, but also with land and our water systems. That was a great kind of segue there. So this is kind of what we're going to cover in the short time we have together. I'm going to let my colleague Alex from the city talk about stormwater and provide a little bit of background. And then I'll go into a couple different programs that we've been working with together, specifically with residential homeowners to try and reduce the amount of stormwater runoff that comes from their properties using green infrastructure. So Alex, are you ready to jump in?
I'm here, yeah, thank you, Patrick. All right, so the City of Guelph in the heart of Ontario has approximately 145,000 residents, and that's according to the last census in 2021. And Guelph is the largest community in Canada that relies almost completely on groundwater for our water supply. which means that compared to other cities near rivers or lakes, Guelph's water supply takes longer to replenish and is more vulnerable to overuse and groundwater contamination. However, the Guelph community does take water conservation seriously, and it has been a big focus and effort for staff, council, and residents for many years now. As a result, Guelph residents use approximately 156 liters of water a day, compared to the Canadian average of 220 liters per day. In the last few years, Guelph has made big strides in including stormwater management in that priority with the introduction of a stormwater service fee in 2017. Prior to the service fee, there was a $4.1 million funding gap for stormwater services. The new fee provides stable and dedicated funding for stormwater service and is billed directly to residents on their utility bills with hydro water and wastewater charges instead of being funded through property tax. I can get the next slide. Yeah. And so why is it so important to switch to a service fee for financing Guelph's stormwater management? As you can tell by the multi-million-dollar funding gap, stormwater services were simply underfunded year after year through property taxes. Our stormwater management system assets received an F failing grade on the 2012 Sustainable Infrastructure Report and Infrastructure Scorecard, with no real improvement in the 2015 update to that report. Risks of continued underfunding include flooding, stream erosion, negative impact on waterways and groundwater supplies, such as pollution, potential failure or reduced effectiveness of the city's stormwater systems, and difficulty meeting regulatory requirements. Not to mention, just the longer you wait, the more prices increase and the farther the gap will widen. It was becoming clear that the risks of not switching up our financing model would far outweigh any negative opinion or backlash that may result from the media or public about a new service fee. All options for rate structures were studied and considered, and we landed on using the equivalent residential unit or ERU method, where every residential property pays the same amounts. So regardless of lot size, house size, or type, each residential dwelling unit pays the same fee amount per month. If you have an accessory apartment in the house, that is considered 2 dwelling units, so you are charged the service fee times 2. Similarly, a condo building with, say, 20 units would pay the service fee times 20. And as of today, the service fee is $7 a month. Commercial and industrial stormwater fees are based on the impervious area of the property. So each individual property has their hard surfaces measured, and then we divide that measurement by 188 square meters, which is the average across the city residential hard surface area. This is how their number of ERUs is established, which is then multiplied by the $7 rate. Next slide. There was a want at the time of fee implementation to also develop and implement incentive programs in order to reward properties who were already reducing stormwater runoff quantity or improving runoff quality, and as an attempt to encourage LID and green infrastructure source controls. So we have both residential and non-residential rebate and credit programs in place, made possible entirely through stormwater service fee funding. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Patrick, who we partner with to deliver some of these programs, to take you through some more details on a couple of them.
Perfect. Thank you, Alex. So I'm going to talk about those top 2, the rain garden rebate and the subsidized backyard tree planting program. If you'll indulge me for a second, though, I'll just provide a little bit of context about who we are. We are a Green Communities Canada member organization. I believe since 2006, we've been part of GCC. We're an environmental charity, and we serve, communities in the Grand River watershed with our programs around rain gardens and green infrastructure. It's primarily in the urban built-up areas of that area. To lead into some of the work we've done with City of Guelph, we did a pilot with which we called Rain Smart Neighborhoods, which was designed to break down some of the barriers to installing green infrastructure with residential homeowners, such as time, money, know-how, the usual big 3. We found another critical motivator for residential homeowners was aesthetics. So as a critical piece of that, we provided people with not only sort of a plan of action, but help them with their landscape design and sort of thinking out not just for, you know, building out a rain garden, for example, but thinking about how they're going to use their property for the next, you know, 10, 15 years or however long they're going to be there. And that's really critical to ensure that not only green infrastructure gets installed, but it's going to be, you know, a feature of the landscape for years to come. So the rain garden rebate program that was designed, I'll definitely give a nod to, again, GCC for their work and developing the RAIN program, which was a real sort of antecedent to this program, and other GCCs like Eco Superior and Thunder Bay and the City of Thunder Bay for having their own rain garden program, which we unabashedly stole elements of. But the Guelph program specifically offers up to $2,000 for a rain garden, and that's tied to the estimated volume of stormwater that it is meant to capture. So it works out to about 50 cents a liter is what people get reimbursed for. And that $2,000 is sort of a sweet spot where, you know, if there's a DIY project, then people, you know, can cover almost all of their costs. But if they want to hire a contractor, we're fairly agnostic about that. They'll probably spend more than $2,000, but they'll get, you know, a not insubstantial amount back as part of going through that project. And the key piece, like I said, is just having that rain garden coach, which guides people through the design process, but also the logistics of submitting their application, getting their rebate, really hand-holding people through the whole process. And another one, like I said, we're pretty shameless in terms of picking up and stealing programs from other regions. We brought the backyard tree planting program, which was developed by LEAF in the Greater Toronto area, and they've been delivering for over 20 years. And it's been very successful there. So we thought we would bring it to Guelph and the Grand River watershed. We actually do it with last year with 4 different municipalities in the watershed. But the key part of this also is we work with residential homeowners who are on the private side, which is really critical for being able to mitigate some of these stormwater issues that we have, because only so much can be done on the public infrastructure side. So the backyard tree planting program, very similar type, you know, at a high level, what's involved is we try and provide a full wraparound service where we have an arborist go to somebody's house, make sure that they're picking the right tree for the right place. You know, we pick native species, so you know, the tree is going to have the best chance to reach maturity. Again, sort of looking out not just in the short term. And we also engage the homeowner to make sure that they've committed to making sure that tree gets established and have a you know, mulching and watering and looking after it for the first critical 2 years of its life. So I think I'm pretty much out of time. So I'll leave it there, and then I'll be part of the panel discussion and breakout sessions too if there's questions. So I'll hand it back to Christine.
Great. Thank you so much, Patrick and Alex. All right, so we are going to move now to Tim Van Cedars, who's with the Sustainable Technologies and Evaluation Program. And he's going to share with us some of the learnings around maintaining and operating green infrastructure through that program.
Okay, thank you. Let's get set here. Yes, thank you, Christine. So I'll be talking about the topic of LID inspection and maintenance and focusing mainly on the municipal green stormwater infrastructure systems, not so much on the residential side. Let's see here. But before launching into that main topic, I thought it'd be worth reflecting on where we've been with stormwater infrastructure maintenance, which in Ontario, until recently at least, has been dominated by large centralized stormwater management ponds and oil grit separators for water quality treatment of smaller areas. Those oil grit separators are quite interesting because, much like LID, they are distributed across the landscape on both public and private lands. In a study we did several years ago, we estimated there was probably around 18,000 to probably around more than 20,000 today across Ontario, and only about a quarter of those are really being inspected, and likely less than 10% are being maintained. And of course, when they're not maintained, they operate in bypass mode, providing no treatment at all. Unfortunately, the story of stormwater management ponds is not much different, at least in the past. We have well over 1,000 of these in the Greater Toronto Area. And one of the step partners, LSRCA, another conservation party, did a detailed study of 98 ponds in their jurisdiction and found that 55% were well past their maintenance state, and 12 were so full they could no longer be classified as ponds. And you kind of see that in the picture there too. That situation has gotten a little bit better over time, but it's not that distant in the past when we were there. So what went wrong? Well, part of it's just human nature. We like building things, but not necessarily taking care of them. It's not unique to stormwater. We see this in other industries as well. Since we can't see the sediment building up in the oil grit separators and ponds, it's easy to ignore and instead focus on other priorities. On public lands, as was highlighted in the earlier presentation, stormwater has always been the poorest of the three waters, and it's hard to build a good maintenance program without sustainable funding, even for the most basic task of tracking where the facilities are, which is why a big focus in the past for a number of Ontario municipalities has been on the funding side. On private lands, where there are smaller, mostly underground practices, the property owners often don't know they have stormwater infrastructure on their properties. And in our experience, not all municipalities track this infrastructure, and definitely don't enforce the maintenance either. So LID, low impact development, what we sometimes call green stormwater infrastructure, presents the new challenges, in part because there's a general lack of experience maintaining the many different types of LID practices, but also because the practices are much more distributed than they once were, which arguably could complicate the process of inspection and maintenance. If there are facilities on private properties, regulatory mechanisms need to be in place to ensure these are looked after over time. And of course, there needs to be standard procedures for the different types of inspections, which might not also exist in a lot of municipalities right now. Now, that's kind of the bad news. On the positive side, we found that, through a lot of different studies, that LID is generally very resilient and often doesn't need a great deal of maintenance, at least if you take out the surface side, the gardening side. But the other aspects of it don't really require a lot of maintenance. We've monitored a number of older facilities, some dating back to the early 1990s, and found that while regular inspections are needed, the interventions are very minor, and new designs are focused on making maintenance even easier nowadays. So we're seeing a really good positive results. With LID, unlike that other infrastructure, you can actually see, at least the surface LID, you can see that maintenance needs to be done. So the out of sight, out of mind problem is not much of a barrier here. And some practices like bioretention, which is shown here, can even perform better over time as the plants grow and the roots loosen up the soils and improve infiltration. So in the next several slides, I'll talk a bit about some of the key elements of LID maintenance. The most important of these is the development of a strong inspection and maintenance program at the municipal level. This is a more detailed topic than I have time for today, but some of the key elements of a program would include a system for tracking where the infrastructure is located and its condition and any work done. And of course, the asset management process that's going on now is helping a lot with that in Ontario, at least. Policies are needed on what type of LID should be accepted for meeting approval criteria, how they should be designed from a maintenance perspective, how they should be maintained as well. Typically, a program would require having standard operating procedures and checklists that lay out the types of maintenance and activities and schedule. And a key question, as I mentioned before, that needs to be addressed in the program is whether or not LID is to be located on private property, from a perspective at least, and if so, how maintenance of these would be enforced. Inspections are critical throughout the full life cycle of the LID practices, and there are 4 main types listed on that top row there. These are relatively well known. Construction inspections, as the name suggests, are conducted during construction to ensure conformity with design drawings and specifications. Very important to have as-built drawings done of both the surface and underground infrastructure. Often we see these things missing. They're often asked for, but then they're not provided in the end. Project assumption inspections, this is sometimes called project acceptance inspections or warranty inspections. These are conducted both after construction and before transfer of ownership to the municipality, so that you know what you're getting, you know, at the end of the day, that you're getting a working piece of infrastructure. And of course, the routine operation inspections, as the name suggests, are done on a regular basis to document status and identify deficiencies or potential for failure. And then those verification inspections, those are done less often, 5 to 15 years or so, and involve a little bit more detailed monitoring to kind of understand how that system is functioning. And then of course, if something's wrong, there's a forensic inspection and training, a testing is what we call it, that needs to be done in order to determine the cause of the deficiency and the necessity for follow-up actions. So I mentioned before that the practices should be designed to ensure that they can be easily inspected and maintained. Here I'll just say a few words about common problem areas like inlets, the importance of pre-treatment and incorporating the right functional elements to support the overall I&M program. Inlets are especially important because this is where we often see blockages with debris, garbage, or sediment. They're very common. Everything goes through the inlets, and there are lots of different types, from sheet flow inlets to curb cuts or forebays, where all the runoff enters at one point, and of course, underground infrastructure like catch basins or depressed drains on the curb side. To avoid buildup of debris at the entrance, curb cuts in particular need to have those wide openings with 45-degree turns and sufficient grade down into the facility. I can't say how often we don't see that, and the problems start to occur. Water does not like to take a 90-degree turn along the gutter. I need to help it along by creating the right grades and bends. Small curb cuts and cheater just don't work, as I show on the right there. In addition to that good inlet design, there's a lot of talk about this these days. It's very important to pre-treat wherever possible. And there's lots of options available, from catch basin inserts to larger OGS or filtration devices for, you know, that's kind of more for centralized inflow, generally not applicable to most smaller LIDs. Sumps on either side of the curb or at the curb cut entrance, and filter strips along the shoulder for sheet flow, which is a little bit more common for swales. For those catch basin inlets, pre-treatment is particularly important because studies have shown that catch basins often scour very large amounts during high-intensity rain events. They collect sediment and then they scour it all during those really intense events, which can all go into your practice, of course, if you're not careful. In all cases, you know, the basic principle here of pre-treatment is that you're centralizing the bulk of sediment and debris in an area that's easy to access for clean-out. Another problem we see often in the designs is a lack of cleanouts for underground pipes and the lack of inspection ports to diagnose issues. Cleanout pipes, as shown here, need to have gentle 45-degree turns for the jetback and camera inspection equipment to gain access. Often they don't exist at all. These extras are quite inexpensive to include during construction, very helpful as a diagnostic and maintenance tool. So really encourage those. It's in the later stages of the life cycle that these can be really quite handy. And finally, just a few words about choosing the right surface cover. We often see gardens put in where the time and person power needed to keep those looking good has not been established in advance. You know, gardens are great, trees are wonderful, love them. I mean, I'd much prefer to see gardens and trees, just like anyone would. But if there's no real commitment on behalf of the municipality or the owner to look after these things, then you know it's just going to look really bad over time. So consider grass or something simpler that fits in with the maintenance budget if there's not enough budget to do the gardens. River stone is another common element. I show that on the left here. We see it quite often, but experience has shown that once the weeds start to root in the stone, it can be quite difficult to keep it looking nice. And we've seen municipalities start to turn away from river stone because of that. It's just sometimes very difficult to deal with. And it's very common as kind of a splash pad too, but they're trying to get rid of that as well and sort of focus more on the sumps. And I think that pretty much does it. We do have a very detailed low impact development stormwater management practice inspection and maintenance guide on our website. So take a look at that. It's got all those kinds of checklists and the 200 documents. There's a lot of information there. We're going to be taking the key parts of that guide and putting it onto our Wiki Sustainable Technologies Guide, which is a planning and design guide for LID. So the highlights are going to be over there, but that guide will still exist. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Tim. Alrighty, last but not least, we have Bert Van Duyn, who is going to speak to us a little bit about going from theory to practice when it comes to green infrastructure implementation. So Bert, if you're able to share your screen, I know you're going to keep your video off.
Actually, Christine, you're going to bring it up. So can you do that because of the challenges with my access today?
Yes, I will do that right now. Just loading here.
Perfect. And I'll start while you're loading it up there. So good afternoon, everyone. We started today with one Dutchman, and we'll have another one to wrap up the presentations. Sometimes I call myself an early climate change refugee, leaving the lowlands of the Netherlands for the highlands of the Western Canadian prairies. I'm the drainage technical lead at the City of Calgary Water Resources, and I also am a founding member and past president of the Alberta Low Impact Development Partnership, dabbled in universities, and specifically I'm heavily involved with the Canadian Standards Association. Next, please. So when Christine last year approached me, she suggested this title of Bridging the Gap to Implementation. And I figured she had seen actually a paper that I've offered with a number of wonderful colleagues across the country about resiliency of urban stormwater management, and provided the link here where you can find this as an open source document. Next, please. But really, it's just like where we're talking about gaps, where are those gaps? And it's not just talking about the gaps, but also some thoughts as to potentially bridging some of these gaps. So breaking through that wall. Next, please. So here's a number of thoughts, and this is sharing some thoughts as to, from my perspective, I'm coming here specifically as a municipal engineer, having a background in both consulting and working for the last 12 years at the City of Calgary. Now, a key part is, first of all, this is like engineers, this is like, it's not that they don't want to implement green infrastructure, but for most of them, they don't have targets. And an engineer, we're very simple people. We work with numbers. It's need to have something to go on. But with that too is we're talking about certain items here, like urban heat islands. When you raise that with the typical engineer, you'll have the deer in the headlights type of, look, what does it mean? Now, and so those are some parts where we really need to work on. There is definitely some progress there in Ontario with the LID manual coming up. Hopefully that will provide a good example for the rest of the country. We did talk a bit about private land, and private land is really important because it's such a huge component of our watershed. But you can't just think that people will just simply accept that. So the social aspects we've talked about these 2 days are so important. Some of us are looking at this too as to examples. What can be done as a function of, say, the land use and the parcel size? I know Vancouver is talking about it, Toronto, Wien, Calgary, and so on. The common terminology, we've heard that a few times, and it's really important because otherwise you're dealing easily with false expectations. A rain garden is not the same as bioretention, so we can't be sloppy in the type of terminology we use. A lot of people are afraid for this because they don't just see the forest for the trees, but like almost as like step back, take a breath, take a pill if necessary, and look at it as to what are the functions as to what we're trying to do. But really important too is this multidisciplinary nature, because we're dealing here with parts that go way beyond traditional engineering. It's not that our engineers and operators don't want to do green, especially if it is not made of concrete. Just joking aside, it is different for them and they need to evolve. Next, please. So the question, one back please, as to has the theory been settled on LID? Well, yes, no. The need for LID and GIS, that's definitely been settled. But what is the optimal combination of these types of things is still open to debate. And we had in the previous discussions as to the potential for abuse of some of this. But there are legitimate questions. What happens with that water that infiltrates? Where does it go? We have to make sure it's not going to go into a basement, a seepage somewhere, because then we're needing to deal with a backlash type of thing. Nutrients, energy, other resources. A lot of these practices may call for sand. Well, that's a scarce resource. Now, what we do see is definitely there are some urban myths that we're dealing with and naysayers. And the quote there from Upton Sinclair, it's like that's a reality we're dealing with. It's almost like the cigarette lobby has come back again to LID. And I'm calling for us to connect across the country as to where we can debunk some of these urban myths, because a lot of them are urban myths. Next, please. But we have to keep in mind too, as to context is everything. There are very significant differences across the country. And so the approaches that would be of interest, they may differ quite significantly. For instance, here on the Western Prairies, we're in a semi-arid region, so harvesting of rain water and runoff are very much of interest. Why? Well, because the summer season is the season of high runoff as well as high evapotranspiration. That'll be very different in, for instance, Vancouver, where the rains fall in the winter and the ET is high in the summer. So findings from one region, you cannot necessarily extrapolate. And it's this thing, this is like the Bill Gates of so copy and paste. We can't be that lazy. We have to see as to what its relevance is to our regions. But a key aspect with this is that the fundamental processes and the operations that are underlying this are the same. It's the combinations that will be different. It's very important to have with that when we're looking at information to normalize it so that we can put it into context and compare it. Next, please. So here's an example from our paper. I'm looking at it largely from a flood perspective, providing information to the design community. With this, one can look very quickly in that forest as to what are the kinds of trees that would be of relevance to this particular approach. Next, please. So some of the challenges too is our analytical tools, when it comes down to it, they're still in its infancy. Yes, suppliers may often have tools, for instance, for a permeable pavement, but they're always looking at it from a single purpose. We don't implement infrastructure on a single purpose. There are many different ways that come together. the representation of LID and green stormwater infrastructure is still relatively poor, especially when we need to look at things from a continuous water balance perspective, not just one single event. We need to get an appreciation of soil moisture conditions with the vegetation. That said, what we've learned definitely over here is you design for drought, and it will enjoy, especially with native species, that extra moisture when it comes. Tim already talked about STEP's life cycle tool and the other tools that are being offered. Very good, but we need to get data across the country. Similar on triple bottom line tools, we've got a very good tool, Canadian tool under development, but we need to get to the data, especially on these secondary benefits that some of the other speakers talked about as well. Next, please. So Tim already talked about asset management and the need for that, how important it is. Yes, it is in its infancy. I'm actually a co-editor of an upcoming handbook on asset management for urban drainage. In about 2 years, we hope to have that. When I'm talking to the chapter editors, you see again that deer in the headlights things when we're talking about green infrastructure and such, because they're not used to it. There's progress. Again, as I think Laura talked about that, or one of the other speakers on Ontario Regulation 588.17, or that other example there. Success stories are awesome, but you know what? Besides, we don't have enough of them, but they don't necessarily tell us why something didn't work. I'm actually more interested in hearing failure stories, the things that we often try to hide. But we can learn more from that because that will show what we can need to avoid. I'm very much calling for standards. We only have a few of them yet pertaining to green infrastructure. Some of the standards, such as even for flooding, are calling for LID and green stormwater infrastructure as well, but we definitely need a lot more. And that's not just a selfish thing as a CSA person, because that's all volunteer type of work. And so it's just like I'm creating my own evening and weekend type of work. But with a lot of this is don't make it overly complex. Landscaping is not that complex, as Sheila will tell you. And as well as to share the information on this. Share, share, share. Next, please. So one of the last parts is the educational gap. It's so important. There are not enough people out there that know this. And so the universities and colleges, they're not meeting our needs. We need to have dedicated programs for it. But for us who are working in government or industry, we do need to give back as well. Those are often the most attractive ways of moving forward on this. Can we please share information on this? STEP, awesome, but we need to translate that across the country on that. Next, please. So, in summary, what we're talking about here, it's still quite immature. As I said, like the other lines of service in water, potable water and wastewater have been around for a long time. Stormwater management, only a few decades. We barely know how really even what was happening in our pipes, let alone the ponds and so on. But we have somehow made a lot of progress already. Tim touched on it. Actually, it's maybe not as sensitive at times as it might appear. And I say, it's like, don't be so bloody Canadian as to calling out, trying to be nice, not being nice, as like gray infrastructure does not meet all of our objectives. We're being held to a higher level of standard as to what our conventional practices are being held to. They're not doing what we're supposed to be doing. So we have to call out and help each other with this. Last, please. And having the information that there is, and this is also from the paper, is giving us this appreciation as to we can move forward. Some of this information is being able to be translated. Yes, this will be different from region to region, but some of these effects do carry over again because the fundamentals under it are similar. Last, please. So thanks, Christine, and everyone for the interest. My contact information, if you ever want to talk about it, hey, give me a shout. Just take a few hours for it. Have a great day. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Bert. Lots to think about there. Yeah, really interesting stuff. Yeah, I think that was a really cool session. A lot of people, a lot of different ideas, approaching green infrastructure, urban nature, land tending from a lot of different perspectives. So, so now we're going to go into breakout groups and have our last conversation of the forum, and then come back, and at the very end we'll have a panel discussion, calling back some of our presenters throughout the forum and asking some questions of them. So if there's specific questions that you have that you'd like to ask of the presenters, then you can start thinking of those now, and then we have a few ourselves. So we will take, I think, about 25 minutes for our breakouts, and then come back for the panel discussion at the very end of the day. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I always laugh when people are mid-sentence in a breakout group and get sucked back into the main session. I hope that was a fruitful conversation. I have a lot of things in my head. And now we only have 20 minutes left of the forum. So we are going to have basically a panel discussion with some of our presenters. So we have, let me see, we have Patrick, we have Cameron, Bert, Tim, Carolyn, Sheila, and Laura that are going to be on the panel. And yeah, oh, and Sander too. Sorry, Sander. So yeah, so if there are specific questions for, you can also ask questions, you know, in the chat, or put your hand up. If there's questions that you have of each other as well, feel free to connect and do so in the chat. Otherwise, I have a few questions that I can start with here. So my first question is for, I think, Patrick. I don't think Alex is here anymore, so I don't totally know if you can speak to this. Is Patrick here? Oh, there he is. Okay. So I'm just very interested in, like, if you have any sense of what the public reaction was to the stormwater levy or introducing that. You know, there's like some cities, political leaders that are like the rain tax, and people don't like taxes. And I was chatting with someone a few years ago from the city of Victoria that introduced a stormwater levy to pay for, you know, low impact development, green infrastructure, and she got an earful. There was like people calling and just like they were not happy about it. So I'm just wondering if you have a sense of how that went and how the city mitigated that or kind of communicated that, or maybe Guelph. I mean, Guelph is a kind of interesting place, so maybe people are just more on board, but any insights there?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak a little bit to it, but I can't probably provide the full picture there. I know, and to give a little context, I was around when Kitchener and Waterloo brought in their stormwater utility fee as well. And similar to Victoria, there was a lot of pushback against it. People saw it as a tax. There was a lot of delegations to City Council really against it. Now, I know that there wasn't really with City of Guelph, and I guess what I don't fully understand and just be speculating on is why. And And it could be just because Victoria, Kitchener-Waterloo, Halifax, some of these other places were just kind of the first ones out of the gate. And it's a little more accepted now. Or like you said, Guelph is, you know, a fairly forward, progressive community. And that could be a good reason why. But I know that it kind of flew under the radar a little bit. I think part of it is because it is pretty nominal from a residential side. The heavy lifting really is on the non-residential side. So that might be a factor as well. But
I could chime in there too, because we've looked at a number of these systems come in place in different parts of Ontario. So yeah, Kitchener was the first, and I think that's why they got they got a little bit more of a headache, you know, trying to get that through. Kitchener-Waterloo. Then Mississauga did it, and they had a little bit of an easier time, but not super easy. Brampton then did it, and they had a really easy time. Like they just copied Mississauga's system for the most part. It's very similar in structure to the Mississauga one. And they had a very easy time sort of moving that through, and Guelph was kind of doing it at the same time. So it might be just that, you know, we're accepting that stormwater does need to be funded, and I think people are coming around to that idea and having the precedents there as well. I think it's important. You can say, well, you know, they did it, but if you're the first, then there's often a lot of pushback because people aren't used to it and they don't understand the reasons for it. But if it's already been tested and tried somewhere else, that's important. So I'm glad we have these examples in Ontario. I'd be interested to hear in other areas of Canada, you know, whether this has been successful.
Sorry, can I chime in just in regards to that? I was wondering if there was any shift in the budget from the regular infrastructure, because as you're funding stormwater with the levy, you're also reducing infrastructure costs if you're not putting the same stressors on that regular stormwater infrastructure, right? So are you seeing any shifts in the budgeting that way?
My understanding is that it's just more money. It's more money. It's not like the gray infrastructure is getting underfunded or less funded. It's just there's more money being put into stormwater infrastructure as a priority. And potentially that does mean that taxes increase, but don't call it a tax, you know, because then you'll get in trouble. But yeah, you probably are seeing slightly higher taxes, but very minimal. Like it's amazing how small the tax rate has to go up to put a huge fund together to do this kind of thing. It's not very much. That's my understanding, anyways, and I'd be happy to be corrected.
My understanding as well is basically there is some latency and it takes time to build up those funds. I know Kitchener, we talked about, brought in their stormwater utility fee, I think it was in 2012 or 2011. And now is really when they're finding that they have the capital to undertake some really major projects. So it does take time to build those up. And I think it'll take even longer to really see the effects of, you know, green infrastructure and the efficiencies of it. So I think there's additional latency probably sort of built into that too.
Yeah, Bert, I see you have your hand up there.
Yeah. I think you need to be careful here because there are different things that we're talking about. Because this is like, are we talking here about creating utility that should have enough funding, or are we talking about, well, for instance, the Guelph example, who is paying for what as part of that utility? And that was the Guelph example, for instance, as to that larger properties with more hard areas and such should in fact pay more because they can have a greater load on the infrastructure and such. I think as to the question, will green infrastructure help in reducing, say, other parts? Of course, the challenge that you have with all of this is, and especially with stormwater, is in most of our communities we're already dealing with a huge infrastructure deficit. And the deficit is only going to be made worse if climate change is going to play out the way the climate scientists are telling us. That's what I tell our people too. It's just like, we better invest in this, otherwise better invest in life jackets and bleach, because you're going to need a lot of it. But it's the thing is like, it's part of an overall combination. I don't think we should necessarily be looking at it to have one being replaced by the other. It is more supplementing it as to meeting that very wide perspective of objectives that we need to have, because I think it's a more effective use of our scarce financial resources. But those are the realities that we face.
Cameron, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah,
Well?
I think that's a good point, and I was thinking too about the deficit, right? We're already in we're falling behind, but and that often the questions get asked. Okay, if we're going to put in green infrastructure, then are we going to be saving money on pipe sizing or something like that? And I think that the answer generally is no, because of climate change and higher intensity, duration, frequency of storm events and things like that. But we do know that GI will help with flooding and the sort of future condition that we're going to be seeing. But we also have a regulatory requirement to clean the water before it is discharged. And so I think that often that regulatory piece seems too readily discounted. And people will say, well, is the federal government or is the provincial government going to fine us for overflowing or polluting? And I think that as we go forward, I hope that conversation continues to evolve. And I'll mention in the Vancouver context it's really, I think, the Tsleil-Waututh Nation on Burrard Inlet who has really done a lot of work on trying to make the point around aspirations to reintroduce a food fishery in Burrard Inlet, which doesn't really align with sort of some colonial kind of approaches to water management. And so I think that's an important evolution, as well as the last thing I'll mention is sort of, if we look at the American context and the Environmental Protection Agency, where decisions and investments are made, again, in response to a regime of fining. And so I think in the Canadian context, I think we can learn a lot from doing better, given that we don't really operate in that same sort of litigious environment.
Cool. Andrew, I know that you had a question as well. Did you want to ask that of the group?
Yes, absolutely. And I've roughed it out, so please bear with me as I try to articulate it in a polished sense now. I was very interested earlier this afternoon by a couple of things across presentations that I noticed that had possible overlap, but also maybe some tension between them. On the one hand, a few of our presenters today, is also yesterday as well, spoke about how professionals and practitioners in GI are often calling for more shared terminology so that we can all, quote unquote, speak the same language across different contexts or types of GI in different communities. And on the other hand, today, Carolyn so well shared with us the ideas of two-eyed seeing and the ways that settler colonial discourse or ways of talking about land management has conceived of nature and human as two separate things. So I was wondering if the panel could speak to challenges and opportunities at the intersection of this discourse around sharing the same language and thinking about some of the ideas shared by Carolyn around two-eyed seeing and decolonializing language.
Thanks, Andrew. And Sheila, I saw that you had your hand up. I'm not sure if it was to address this question or the question before, but you can say what you'd like to say.
Well, I think they're kind of related too, actually. I put a short one-page thing.
Oops.
If you can see it, but the idea of our values and how we relate to water and how we talk about water, and looking at, you know, could this fee be a tool for social transformation? Can we use it to invest in things like the great program Calgary has about watershed plus, or the water plus art? So through the work I do as a landscape architect, I'm often thinking, how do I reveal water? Because people don't see it, right? It goes underground, it's hidden, we don't acknowledge it. People only see it if it's flooding. So let's celebrate it. Let's find ways to make it part of our experience. And I have to say that it has been so well received. Tim had an image and he uses of one of my projects with cattails on a trench drain. You know, there are issues with the construction of the project, but the actual art and storytelling piece, people love it. And they ask questions about it. I've had people come up to me and say, hey, I see you're looking at that garden. Did you know this was designed for stormwater? And you know, they tell me about how it connects to the lake, and they're showing me, I'm like, they have no idea I'm the landscape architect. So we've like inspired using design and what we put in the public realm can have people think about water differently. Because I realized when you have a city, you have like 27% of a city's roads. Most of the city lands are private lands. So we need to actually bring people along with us, right? We can't just have the capital projects do the work. We have to educate, do it, change the way we practice, but use it as an opportunity to have people's eyes open about their relationship to water as well.
Yeah, and I've seen some great signage on some of these green infrastructure projects, like when the pictures that I've seen from Vancouver. You know, Cameron can comment on that too. But often there's Indigenous acknowledgement and Indigenous art inside the green infrastructure, which is really inspiring. You know, we have projects like that with Raindrop Plaza. You know, you had designed a sign around the Raindrop Plaza piece. You know, to just kind of increase awareness of, you know, what it is and what we're trying to sort of convey there. So I think that sort of public art and signage and communication piece of the green infrastructure is really important, and it helps to make it more accessible to a larger sort of group of people rather than just engineers.
Sander, did you want to chime in as well?
Yeah, just quickly, I think language is very important, and different communities use different language. And sometimes we need to think about communities that have been marginalized and how we can get them more engaged and understand their language. And sometimes we actually want to create new communities of people that are not yet talking to each other, working together, and they need to develop a shared language. That's when terms like green infrastructure and nature-based solutions come in. So I think both the shared language and diversification of language, I think both approaches are needed at the same time.
Laura?
Yeah, that question made me think about stretching language and seeing these mismatches in language as opportunities for learning, because I think the mismatch in term is not just that it's not just that we need to, it's not that we need to come to the same place and agree, as Sander was saying, but instead there's a lot of ways of approaching things that are wrapped up in the language that we use. So I've been thinking a lot in this session about how the different terms that we use represent opportunities for us to learn from people who are using different terms, and thinking about what needs to be done to stretch what common language or the most dominant language might be in order to make space for the kind of transformation that would have successful nature in our cities.
Well, thanks, Laura. Cameron, did you want to comment as well?
Yeah, just as I was listening, and some of the comments through the session today were really interesting, and they kind of reminded me and how we're all operating with sort of a finite envelope of money that we can spend. And so all these projects, GI is always integrated into other projects, and whether it's on parkland, or whether it's in streetscapes, or whether we are trying to infiltrate water into an environment, and the challenges around those kinds of things. But I think it just sort of highlights, and this conversation really just highlights the complexity of the conversation, and the fact that this is difficult work, and it really does require all these different voices working together to just try and move the dial. But I think that there has been so much in a relatively short period of time, so much work being done, because I think this is a bit of the long game, right? And I think sometimes I know I get impatient with sort of the challenges and frustrations, but it's really great to hear everybody sharing their stories, and I think that it does help everybody in their work to hear other people having common challenges and being able to support each other. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that.
Cool. Thanks, Cameron. We are we're at time. I just want to extend, Carolyn, I'm not sure if you wanted to share any thoughts on that question as well. No pressure if you don't want to.
Sure. I'll be real quick. When we're thinking about language, think about your loved ones. Think about those you care about deeply, whether they're a human or maybe an animal companion. And think about how you speak about them. Think of the words that you use to speak about them. Think about the energy that's conveyed when you speak about them. Usually it's with respect, love, maybe gratitude. And so as Indigenous peoples in our original teachings, we see no separation between our human loved ones and all our relations. And so are the words that people are using, are those words fostering respect, gratitude, and love for those relations? Or are they continuously severing and separating us from that relationship? So that's something that I just want to kind of end with. And it's like not even just in our work lives, but in our personal lives as well. So miigwech, Eulalia.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much to everyone. I think this was a really awesome conversation, and I'm really happy to have brought so many different people together. Yeah, I'm very grateful for everyone that was able to join us and share their thoughts and ideas with us. In terms of next steps, we are going to share the recordings and slides that speakers are comfortable with sharing, and we will do a bit of a kind of a summary note that includes some of the resources that have been shared in the chat log throughout the last couple of days as well. And you are always welcome to get in touch with me. I'm happy to hear from all of you, and then when the framework is done, we'll be sharing that as well with the folks that came to the forum. So you can look up for some further correspondence from me and our team. So yeah, thank you very much, and I hope everyone has a lovely cloudy Tuesday, or whatever the sun is doing or not in your neck of the woods. And I hope that our paths will cross again in the not so distant future. So thank you very much. Take care, everyone.